My guest today is Thomas Van Nortwick. Thomas, the Nathan A. Greenberg Professor of Classics Emeritus at Oberlin College in Ohio, where he taught from 1974 to 2016. He received a BA in History from Stanford, an MA in Classics from Yale, and a PhD in Classics from Stanford. He has published scholarly articles on Greek and Latin literature, autobiographical essays, and 6 books. He was awarded the American Philological Association's Excellence in Teaching Award in 1993 and the 2005 Award for Excellence in Teaching by the Northern Ohio Council on Higher Education. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks, Bill. Good to see you, and thank you for asking me.
42 years, if my math is right. That's a long run.
Yeah, and I loved every minute of it. I have to say, I love my job. I was fine with retiring when the time came, but I do miss some aspects of it even now.
Did you do any writing after you
Yeah,
left the classroom?
actually continued to write things. I'm luckily I have some former students who are editors of various publications, and they've invited me to write things, and I've been writing a big long-term project for since 2016, interpretive essays on the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they go along with a commentary that's online that helps undergraduates read these poems in Greek. So it's fun for me. I'm mostly using material from my teaching, and I'm very grateful to have this work that my student has offered me.
I don't know whether this comes under full disclosure or not, but in the fall of 1960, Tom and I arrived at the same boarding school where we were roommates, and we've kept in touch ever since, at least in our adult lives. So this is nothing rare. And you may ask, if you're listening, you may ask, well, why are you having a classics professor on a show about addiction? And this gets back to, I would say, the autobiographical essays that the introduction referred to. Um, you have a history of alcohol use in your family, Tom, and let's get to it.
Yes, that's true. I am from what you would call an alcoholic family. The disease has devastated my family for generations. In fact, um, I know that the Kingfisher Project is devoted to raising awareness about heroin and opiates and so forth. But I'm just going to talk about alcoholism today because that's all I have personal experience with. I myself am not a recovering alcoholic. I'm not, never was afflicted with the disease, but my mother was an alcoholic all of all of her life. She died in 1987 at the age of 71 from basically because of alcoholism. Her younger brother also died in his 50s from it. On my mother's side, the disease goes back generations. My mother's grandfather was the mayor of Atlanta, a very successful man who killed himself, um, supposedly cleaning his gun, but it's pretty clear that he shot himself. And he was an alcoholic, and my grandmother, my mother's mother, found him when she was a little girl. She was the one who found him, and of course, a horrible moment for her, about which I never heard from her. She never spoke about it to me. I only heard later from other family members. But it seems to skip a generation. I mean, I'm not scientifically qualified to talk about uh, alcoholism in a biological sense, but I believe absolutely that it's a disease and that it has a genetic origin. And in my family, as I say, my great grandfather, my mother, and several of her siblings had the disease, and then it skips a generation. My particular generation does not, although lots of us kids, none of us, for one reason or another, got the physical trigger. But then one more generation down, and there have been a couple of of my relatives who have succumbed, let's say, one of whom died in his 30s, another of whom I'm delighted to say is alive and well and in recovery. But it my mother was married 3 times, my father was married 3 times, and every person they were married to was married 3 times. So that's 27 marriages. And one time I was sitting with a friend and I got a placemat from a restaurant and wrote out all the marriages and circled the alcoholics that I knew about. And there weren't too many names that weren't circled. It's swept through my family in a really, as I say, devastating way. And I myself have been in recovery, as they say, as a member of a family of alcoholics for since 1983. So whatever that is, 42 years. No, that's not right. So 32 years. Anyway, a long time. And I'm I'm delighted that more is becoming known about the disease. When I was with you in school, Bill, uh, I had no idea about any of this stuff. All I knew was that my family life was um, very fraught, very chaotic. When I went to the school that you and I went to, the boarding school, um, it was. I have said to many people, it kind of saved my life because at home things were completely spinning out of control. My mother had married for a third time to a really sweet, lovely man who was also an alcoholic, and their marriage was decimated by the disease. And by the time it was time for me to go to our school, things were very much in disarray around our house. And I found that being at the school was the thing that kept me going. And the things that I loved about it were the things that horrified all of my fellow students. When I went to Stanford for my undergraduate degree, I used to tell my friends about what it was like to be at the school, and lots and lots of rules. Never everything was extremely structured and so forth. That's exactly what I needed because there was nothing like that at home. And in particular, I don't know, I wrote some things down for myself to try to sort of sum up for myself what it was about the school and about the experience that helped me. But basically, um, I I think that the predictability of the life there, and in particular the predictability of discipline and things like that. There are a lot of rules, but I felt at least that they were applied impartially and that there was something sort of personal about it, and it was very clear. If you did this, you got this. If you did that, you got that. At home, never. I might do something that I thought somebody wanted me to do, but they may not have noticed. They may not, in the end, have cared. And I know that my mother loved me. I know that she did in the best way that she could. But she was sick. She had a disease, and she could not really, uh, you know, be there as a mother for me the way I always hoped that she would be. And so going away to school, although I was often very lonely there, it was a haven for me. And in particular, it was, as I say, wonderful because it was clear to me what I had to do to succeed. And I had, if I chose to do that, then success would come my way. And I loved it, frankly, much to the uh, surprise of all my friends in 1965 in Northern California who couldn't quite see that as the haven that I did. But um, anyway, that may be more than you wanted to know.
No, not at all. And I'm well aware that your success was academic, that you're able to accomplish a lot in the classroom because of your commitment to what you were doing.
Yes, I definitely would say that was true, and I what my why I am a professor of classics. It's a long story that's too long for our show here, but the important thing is that at the time it felt like a kind of an impulsive choice that I jumped toward being a major in classics at Stanford. Then I jumped at the chance to get into graduate school, which was, in my mind, and in the mind of a lot of others, a real long shot, but it happened. Um, and once I was finished with graduate school, I didn't particularly like it. A lot of people love graduate school and they stay forever. I didn't like it. I wanted to get a job and go to work. I wanted to be a teacher. Once I started teaching, um, I found the experience of being in the classroom to be exhilarating and nurturing and all the other positive words I could think to say for it. Every year, I got a whole fresh load of smart, bright kids who were eager to know about stuff that I was teaching, who were, very responsive. I mean, it was to me, it was a wonderful situation. Um, Academic life being what it is, or at least what it was when I was there, you also had to, you know, do certain things in order to stay in your job to keep tenure. And one of the things you had to do was you had to publish, and that for me was was a challenge. Learning how to do that, and because I was a late starter, I really wasn't very well prepared in the field, and uh, I managed to catch up, but it was a lot of work. And when you say commitment, I had to be committed to this 7 days a week. The whole time I was in graduate school, and but once I got in the classroom, I must say, I did love my work, and my feeling was that I got so much back from the students that in the end I would leave the classroom and I would feel more energized than when I went in. It was a wonderful experience, and I had great colleagues too, uh, about whom I could go on at length. But um, yeah, once I got my job, I realized I loved my job. I wanted to keep it. I wasn't particularly interested in moving. Oberlin, where Mary and I live, my wife Mary and I live, and where we are now, uh, to me was a great place to live. Small college town. The politics fit me. Um, and There's all sorts of things going on. There was a conservatory of music attached to the college, so there was music. It was a kind of heavenly place to me, and in many ways it still is. Uh, so once I got here, I didn't want to leave. But when I came here, I was still completely, really ignorant about the things that were troubling me personally, and almost all can be traced back to uh, my membership in an alcoholic family. And you know, children of alcoholics. That's something that's a subject that's luckily blossomed since the 1970s. I went to work in '74. I started to learn about that in the early '80s, and I started to go to meetings and learn about myself. And what I discovered is that children of alcoholics tend to have certain characteristics that make it very difficult for them to form uh, lasting relationships, intimate relationships. Uh, Children of alcoholics tend to guess at what normal is. Everybody else's family looks like the family that you wish yours was. Uh, they're the normal people. Why are the people in my family not like that? Uh, Also, if you're going to live in that family, and especially if you're a child, it requires a lot of, let's say, deception. I mean, I could say lying. I mean, I think that adult children learn how to lie, and they often lie when it would be just as easy to tell the truth. And not over important things, but over little things. And particularly, adult children are very, very reticent about sharing their own feelings and telling the truth about themselves because They know they're different. They know, and they adult children tend to harbor a lot of shame, and these are characteristics that um, also afflict people who are alcoholics, who have the physical trigger. I mean, my measure of what it's like to be in the family of alcoholics is that in such a family, one person has the disease, has the physical disease, is the addict, but everybody gets it. It's catching. Not in the sense that I was in danger necessarily of becoming someone who couldn't control my drinking, but that all the behavioral characteristics that come along with the disease are adopted by everybody in the family. You can't be in the family unless you essentially play ball. And so you're not well equipped to go out into life and start your own life and start your own relationships and so on, because it turns out that what would work for you at home doesn't work very well in any other relationship. And at least initially, I think it's a complete mystery. Why doesn't it work? Why do my relationships keep failing? Um, I've been married twice. I was married from 69 from 1969 to 1984 to my first wife. It was not a successful marriage, and it was basically sabotaged because both of us were from alcoholic families, and we just didn't know how to. We didn't know how to be grown-ups, and I often will, if I end up talking to someone who has a similar background to mine, we'll admit to each other that, in a certain sense, we always felt as if we were making it up as we go along. We didn't really know, what am I supposed to do next? What do grown-ups do in this circumstance? And that doesn't make you a very good partner in any relationship. If you don't tell the truth, you have a lot of trouble with trust issues. And if you can't trust the person you're in a relationship with, they can't trust you, there's no future, I think. I'll tell you a silly story. In my family, when I was a kid, uh, I never saw an argument start and bloom into some gigantic argument and then get resolved. The people who were arguing would finally get to the other side of it, and one person would apologize, or they would agree to not agree, or whatever. It never finished. What happened in my family was somebody got angry and then stormed out of the room, and then that person was out of the room, and nobody said anything after the person left. And after a while, he or she would come back, and everyone pretend nothing happened. So if you're in that circumstance, you never learn how to have an argument, and which sounds silly, but what it means is you never learned how to truthfully work through difficult problems with another person. And when I was first together with my present wife, Mary, to whom I've been married now almost 40 years, and I am very, very happy. Um, I don't know what the argument was about, but it got to the point where I said, right, this is where I leave. So I started storming out of the room, but Mary didn't understand these rules. So she went after him. She said, "Where are you going? Why are you leaving?" And I had to say I really didn't have any idea. I mean, I couldn't really explain it, except that in my experience, when people get angry and when there are arguments, somebody leaves, and that's how it ends. And she followed me out of the room into the next room. She said, "No, let's talk about this." And one of my proudest achievements in my second marriage early on was that I learned how to have an argument. And in fact, Mary would tell you that I got a little bit too enamored of being argumentative. I was so proud of myself that I could overdo it a little. But, I didn't know what to do because I had never seen two people work through an issue and figure out what was wrong and go on. And so there's all these sort of, nasty messes all over the place, like landmines. And of course, tremendous stuffing of your feelings. I mean, you're mad at somebody and you want them to, you either want them to tell you, no, damn it, I'm not doing that, or, okay, you're right, then that's fine. You can sort of eventually let those go. But if it just stops, it doesn't stop inside you. It just goes into some dark place. And usually what happened with me is that then it would pop up in a completely inappropriate way, and I would take it out on somebody else and thus wreck another relationship because I just couldn't, I didn't know how to get to the end of a dispute. And that's, I guess you put a lot of that under the phrase passive aggressive behavior. I've certainly learned that. And one of the things that allowed me to achieve some level of adult maturity is to try to finally realize that I was behaving that way and decide I didn't want to do that anymore. And it was scary because, I found in the past, if I was mad at someone or whatever, it was much better for me to essentially handle the whole dispute in my own head. The other person didn't get to say anything. I would, just assume, well, then she'll say this, and so I would take care of the whole thing. And it means that I never resolved anything. And and the other thing is, if you don't observe yourself in genuine disputes, in a certain sense, watch yourself when you're getting in an argument. You don't do the thing that most people do, which is to say, "Oh, I'm the kind of person who hates to do that," and "Oh, but I love this." And it really annoys me when you never make those observations. In a certain sense, you never come to know yourself. You don't want to know yourself. And again, one of the very often when I'm talking to adult children, um, we'll set, and we get to the point where we're talking about how we were managed to inching our way out of this black hole that we've been living in. What we were afraid of was not that, if we had to look inside ourselves and learn and be truthful with ourselves about what we were really like, it wasn't so much, at least in my case, I'll say it wasn't so much that I was worried that I would discover I was a bad person. I probably already believed that anyway. But what I thought when I looked inside is I would see nothing, that I was completely empty inside, because that was often the feeling that you had, and it's a terrible feeling, believe me. Again, I'd rather be disappointed in myself, proud of myself, all those other things, rather than think I'm an empty shell, which I did many times. And I started to get better in my mid to late 30s. That's when I finally began to be able to do this stuff. But I went all the way through graduate school and my first marriage without knowing any of this. And to tell you the truth, I'm sure that I damaged a lot of other people. And if you had asked me, I would have said, me? Gee, I'm nice. I only want to help people. I'm friendly, whatever. But in fact, because of my own sort of willful ignorance about myself and about the consequences of my actions, I know that I harmed a lot of people. And I'm happy to say that I was able to circle back and apologize to a lot of those people, but not hardly all of them. And so I would say that the person that I am now is, to a very large extent, the result of my membership in an alcoholic family and my efforts to counteract the negative effects of that. But alcohol was the ruler in my life, even though I am not an alcoholic, and I never, in college, I drank a lot of beer because I was hoping I could get girls to pay attention to me and so on. But I never drank alcoholically. And if I had had the physical trigger, I believe I'd be dead now. I wouldn't even have lived this long. because I didn't have that, whatever the genetic marker is that means that when you start to drink, you can't stop drinking. I mean, that's the key. Um, that that never happened to me because I often drank too much beer. But then when I went to graduate school, I stopped. And but at the same time, I still was a long distance away from understanding about myself. Okay.
Was there
Hmm?
was there a precipitating event or at any point where you said, let me take a look at myself here. Well, I need to do something about this, or was it a gradual process?
Well, I think it was gradual, but the model for alcoholics, as you probably know, Bill, you're much more knowledgeable about this stuff than I am. There's such a thing as hitting bottom, where the alcoholic gets to some point where suddenly they're so low, if they're lucky, they hit bottom and they decide they have to choose another path. For a person who's in Al-Anon, basically, I was in Al-Anon, who's a child of alcoholics, it's a little harder because it's not a matter of now I'm going to stop drinking, now I'm going to stop doing this thing, but really it's more, look, in my case, and I actually, I'm pretty sure I know when it was. It was January of 1983 when I realized. I woke up in the morning and I looked in the mirror and I thought, if I don't do something, then when I'm 50 years old, which of course felt like it was incredibly ancient, I'm going to look in the mirror and nothing will have changed, and I'd rather die than have that happen. I said, if I can't feel less miserable by then, and so I I went to learn about alcoholism, and I went to Al-Anon because I thought if I learned all about it, then I could make my mother stop drinking, and that's often the motives that people have for going into these kind of 12-step programs, and then it's a doomed thing. You can't do it, but anything that gets you there, and that's what I did. I called up in the phone book, and then I got hotline, and I said, my mother's an alcoholic, and how do I make her stop drinking? And this person, God bless him, said, well, we have these meetings. Maybe you'd like to go to these meetings, And I said, yeah, but will there be experts there? And he said, just why don't you try the meeting? And so I went, and I didn't know what the heck was going on. But at the end of the meeting, I listened to everybody talk and so on. I went up to the guy who was running the meeting, and I said, could you point out the experts in alcoholism in the field? 'Cause I'd like to go. I'd like to talk to them. And he said, we don't have any of those here. Well, just like you, buddy. And this is about you, not the alcoholic, and that's a big lesson, which takes some people a long, long time. It took me a long time. The other big thing for me is when I realized, accepted that alcoholism is a disease, and that my mother behaved this way because she couldn't help it. That she was sick, and if she had been able to act in any other way, I'm certain that she would have done so, because I know my mother was absolutely racked with shame, and she felt terrible about herself. But once I was able to accept that it was a disease, then the next step is you can start very slowly to see yourself as being angry at the disease, but not the person. And I went to visit my mother after I'd been going to meetings for about 6 months. We lived in Illinois then, and I was here in Oberlin. And for the last 4 or 5 years, I had not been able to touch my mother physically. I mean, she wanted to give me a hug, and I didn't want to, and I couldn't understand what was going on. I mean, I knew was angry at my mother for not being another kind of person, but I didn't really get it, what was going on. And as soon as I accepted the fact that she was ill, I was able to show her some physical affection. And it demonstrated to me that I could make a little space between the disease and this person who was my mother. And
Tom, I'm going to interrupt just a moment and tell people to continue listening to us on the podcast. This concludes our radio portion, and I'd like to thank you very much for your candor and what we've discussed on the radio.
thank
And I
you.
also want to encourage people to listen to the entire podcast because we clearly got more to talk about. So thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Bill. It's great to be here.
Okay, you were talking about your mother. Let's continue.
Well, yeah, I can say a little bit about my mother. Actually, I could say a lot, but I'll say both my mother and my father actually were from wealthy families, really rich families, and neither of them, in a certain sense, ever really grew up. My mother was the daughter of my grandfather. Her father was the vice president of J. Walter Thompson. There was plenty of money around. She had three brothers, but she was her father's favorite. She was daddy's girl. And my feeling is, she never believed that she could find anyone as good as her father. Her husbands never measured up. And my mother managed to fall in love with and marry three very damaged people. Her first husband, who was the father of my three older half sisters, who are fabulous people, and I love them. But their father was a mess. He was an alcoholic. He killed himself on the second try, in the middle of his fourth marriage. He again was, to all appearances, a superstar. Yale graduates, national champion in squash, owner of a company, and so on and so forth. But his life never really escaped the shadow of alcoholism. And my mother married him. They got divorced. She married my father, who we would need several weeks for me to tell you about all the things that I have wondered about my father. But the one thing that's kind of peculiar is that I don't think my father was an alcoholic. He drank alcoholically. He drank heavily. The stories are that he was carried into his house night after night after night in his 20s and 30s. But then, when he was 50 years old, he decided that he wasn't going to drink anymore, and he didn't. And he never went to any meetings. And it's my belief, my experience, that people who are afflicted with the disease can't do that. That they can't just stop. So anyway, but my father was in other ways a very flawed person, very damaged person. And their marriage lasted, let's see, they got married in 1945, 53, 8 years, 8 or 9 years. They got divorced. Then my father married a third time. But lucky for him, he married my dear stepmother, Betty, who was already in AA and ended up staying in the program for 64 years. So she was a recovering alcoholic. And I think that's part of the reason that my father was able to stop drinking when he was 50. He had some encouragement. My mother, after she divorced my father, then married, again, a guy I said who I really loved, my stepfather, but he was not able really to be the kind of authority figure that I would have liked. He was very sweet, very kind, but he too was an alcoholic, and his life kind of fell apart in his 50s, and he lived to be 79. But anyway, their marriage, which began in 1956, was kind of doomed from the start because they were both drinking heavily, drinking alcoholically. Um, the town I grew up in was a kind of Illinois version of a John Cheever town, if you know what I mean. A lot of my parents' friends rode the commuter train in and out of Chicago. They had huge cocktail parties Friday and Saturday night, and then Sunday they'd all get together and drink Bloody Marys because they were hungover. And then back on the train on Monday, and off they go again. And not only did my mother die of alcoholism, essentially, but many, many of her friends that I think of as Uncle so and so and Aunt, you know. And again, when we were kids, I had no idea about this, but it was partly the culture, the big, cocktail parties, 50s, and so on. But the people who were unlucky enough to have the physical trigger and entered into that were doomed. I mean, and it killed a lot of them. Some people weren't, and they got through, but not my parents. And I spent. I was angry, resentful of my mother until I was 37, and I finally figured out what was the matter with me and began to deal truthfully with what was the matter with her. And she lived for 4 years after that. My mother died in 1987. She drank alcoholically straight through until 9 months before she died. And finally, her doctor said to her, your liver is going to be destroyed. You have to stop or you're going to die. And I think that he got through. He frightened her. And my mother did stop drinking. She never went into recovery, what I would think it was recovery, but she was dry for the last 9 months. And I um, I went to see her about 6 months, 5 or 6 months before she died in October during our fall break here at Oberlin. And I spent the weekend with her in Illinois. And that was the first time in my life that I ever got to have conversations with my mother that I would consider to be real conversations, adult conversations. And it turned out that she was this wonderful person, very smart, very witty, uh, very interested in me. She noticed me, which of course I loved. Um, when she was drinking, my mother would get up in the morning, make herself a cup of coffee, get the paper and the newspaper. She'd be up around 9. And by 10, she'd start drinking. By noon, she was very drunk. And she would usually take a nap after lunch, sleep it off a little, and she'd get up, make dinner, but she's drinking all the way through dinner, and then go back to bed. And that would go on 365 days a year. And so if you had something important you wanted to talk to your mother about, to my mother about, you had to be there at 9 o'clock. You had to get there at 9 o'clock and try to have that conversation with her before she started drinking. Because once she started drinking, a different person showed up. I mean, it was as if my mother left at 10 o'clock every morning and was gone the rest of the day. And one of the things that adult children suffer from is fear of abandonment, being afraid that you're going to be abandoned. And it's mostly would be seen by others as irrational, but it's a deeply rooted problem. And it makes, of course, a terrible situation for you if you want to be in an intimate relationship. If you're terrified that the person that you decide you're in love with is going to leave you at any moment, it leads to behavior on your part which is, not conducive to keeping things going. What we call people pleasing. I'm sure you've heard that phrase. Um, anything to please the person, or the other way to go. Clinging to the person, or being so afraid that they'll leave that you never want to get into a relationship. I know many children of alcoholics who had terrible trouble ever having an intimate relationship because they were so afraid that the person was going to leave them, that it wouldn't last. That they, again, it's kind of a trust issue, I think. Um, and one more thing I would say about that as a drawback, being such a family, is that you have serious boundary issues. In other words, uh, a person who is suffering from alcoholism um, has very poor sense of boundaries, I would say. And what goes along with the disease, first of all, alcoholism teaches you that you don't have it. That's the first lesson you learn. You're not an alcoholic. And then, if you don't have it, then you've got to find a reason to explain why all these bad things are happening to you and people around you. And that leads to projection and blaming and self pity, all those things that, come because you don't think there's anything wrong with you. You think everybody else is bothering you, is bugging you about quitting drinking and so on. I can remember so many not really conversations where my mother would say, "Oh, I know you want me to stop drinking, but I have to drink. I'm unhappy." And my siblings and we didn't know anything about alcoholism. I look back now with kind of wonder at how ignorant we were, but we would think of all sorts of reasons why my mother behaved that way. Oh, mom's depressed. We just have to get a hobby for mom. If we get her interested in some hobby, join bridge club, whatever it would be, she'd stop drinking. But what we didn't know is that alcohol is a depressant, and she was depressed because she was drunk all the time, and that definitely it was a kind of vicious circle. But we were just as mystified by it, I suspect, as she was. And in my mother's case, I never suffered any physical or verbal abuse of any kind, much anyway, a little verbal, but really none of that. The thing that the disease did to me was take my mother away, essentially remove my mother from my life. Because when she was drunk, she really was that reachable. She wasn't a real person. She was very sentimental, very maudlin. You couldn't really talk to her about anything because she was very impatient with wanting to talk about anything that felt real. And I remember my sister got a divorce, and she went to talk to. They lived in the same town, and she went to talk to my mother. And my sister told me that my mother said, "Well, why didn't you talk to me about it? Why didn't you come and tell me what was going on?" And my sister said I didn't know what to say to her, but the fact is I didn't trust her. I didn't think she could talk to me about it. And so um, loneliness, abandonment. These are the feelings that uh, dominated my response to my mother's illness, uh, and it caused me all sorts of trouble. I mean, I as we've known each other a long time, Bill, and you know that I'm a big extrovert. I like to be around people. I enjoy their company. I like to talk and so forth. But before I was able to really understand myself to any degree, my relationships were always superficial. I didn't have close friendships. I didn't have anybody that I shared anything with. Uh, Certainly not at our school, where you'd rather die than tell anybody what was bothering you. But that carried over for me into the rest of my life, where everybody looked at me and said, "Oh, gee, you've got all these friends. Gee, you're really happy." And another sort of piece of deception that I practiced was to be intent on convincing people that I was okay. I'm fine. Everything's great with me, and don't need to worry about me. And therefore, nobody did. They took me at their word. I didn't. If I had trouble, if I was in pain, I didn't know how to approach anyone. I felt ashamed to say anything about it. Um, Typical things that happen again to children in my situation is that you don't invite your friends over to play, right? You don't want your friends to come over to your house because maybe your mom's going to be drunk. and it's going to be embarrassing. And so you don't do that. And most of the time that probably doesn't matter, but there are times when it was really quite embarrassing for me that I couldn't. The other person would ask me over, and we'd go to her house or his house. Their parents would be there and be normal, but I could never reciprocate. And so that then, alcoholic families have secrets. And the big secret is somebody is sick, but we're never going to tell anybody about it. That is not something we share with anybody outside the family. And it's, that doesn't really work very well for developing relationships. Uh, the other thing that I think about children of alcoholics is that we find each other. There's some kind of radar that happens because if I look at the people, men and women, with whom I've had meaningful, deep relationships, across my life, um, almost without exception, they're from alcoholic families, and I don't know it when I become their friend, or when they befriend me. It's not something you say, "Oh, there's somebody who'll know what I'm talking about," but there's something about that situation that you can sense in another person, and usually it's fine. I mean, Mary doesn't mind my saying this, that she's from an alcoholic family too. And I've never been in a serious relationship with a woman who wasn't. Uh, my first wife, Mary, my girlfriend at the school we went to, um, all from alcoholic families. And there's something about a person in that circumstance that comes through to somebody else who's in that situation. And there's one kind of nice metaphor that I've heard, which is that it's about dancing, right? And that you go to a dance and all these people dancing, waltzing, looking really good dancing. But then you see one person who is dancing in a kind of weird, awkward way. And that's the person you want to dance with because they learned how to dance in their family, and you know how to do it too, and everybody else looks strange and unusual. You know how to dance with that person, and I'm making it a little sillier and a little more obvious than it is, but it exists, that communication. And one of the sort of, I don't know, I guess you'd call it jokes that people in my circumstance often tell to each other is, um, when you see someone across a crowded room, a beautiful person, turn around and run for your life. That's that's because undoubtedly you have chosen the person that is least good for you. And some enchanted evening, right? And in fact, I met Mary at at a place where we were dancing, and I saw her across the room, and it was pretty much instantaneous. But luckily, and this is the part that's important, we were both at that very time, first of all, coming out of unhappy marriages, but also starting to confront the impact of alcoholism on us. And we were both going to meetings, sometimes together, sometimes not. And so we learned how to talk to each other using the language that we were learning in these meetings that we were discovering. And I think, a greater awareness of our own character defects and flaws, and things to watch out for when you're getting involved with another person and so on. So it was just, I will call it blessed, but it was another person might say we were just lucky that we met each other at a time when we were able to uh, to, to use this new way of thinking and talking to each other as a basis for our relationship, and that's continued. I mean, Mary's dad was an alcoholic binge drinker. Her brother died of it in his early 60s. An extremely talented man, had two master's degrees, brilliant, but he never had any kind of a life. I mean, he was from the beginning, his life was wrecked by alcoholism. And the devastation. I mean, I'm sad when in the 70s, really in the early 80s, when I finally learned what might be wrong with me and started to do something about it, was a big, as you probably know, a big upsurge in treatment programs and recovery programs and things like that in this country. And when I first started going to meetings with people, a lot of them had been able to go to, say, a 30-day recovery program before they then ended up in this meeting. Then, by the 90s, I think I would say, the money for these programs went away because I think insurance companies didn't want to pay. I know that's a story for you. Insurance companies did not want to pay for a 30-day thing. Well, you could have 10 days maybe. And basically, the support for these sorts of programs disappeared by 2000. And that's very sad to me because I know a lot of people whose lives were saved by that circumstance, who washed up on the front door of these places when they were there was nothing else for them. But they no longer exist, those things. And the other thing that's kind of frightening to me is that often I will see articles, and probably you may have seen them yourself in newspapers and magazines and so on, written by someone who will say, well, AA is a cult. It's a religious cult. You get brainwashed, and so on and so forth. And it's ridiculous that somebody who is drinking alcoholically can't stop. They lack willpower. That's the old model. And who knows how many people are afflicted by that? But every time I see that, I think people are going to die. That is going to mean that people die because because if you are in this terrible circumstance that you have this illness, you'd rather do anything to get in recovery because that's hard. But if it turns out that you can handle it, I can just cut down all those reasons that people find, you grab it. And I'm convinced that for every one of those articles that gets attention and so on, that leads to a lot of deaths because people they weren't allowed to get to the bottom. And as I say, for me, it was January 1983 is when I would say I hit my bottom, and I went to my first Al-Anon meeting, and I told you about that. And I also went to a therapist. I'm out here in the Midwest in those days. Therapists, that was for people from New York. That was fancy stuff. If you go to a therapist, that's sort of sissy stuff. We didn't do it. But I finally got so miserable that I decided to go. And even then, I went into the therapist's office. This guy's pretty good. And I sat in the chair, and he asked me, and I was convinced that what I was worried about is this guy's going to throw me out of his office because he's going to realize that I'm a fraud, that I'm here on false pretenses, there's nothing wrong with me, and so on. So I'm sitting in the chair, and he asked me one question, and I burst into tears, sobbing. And I figured, maybe there's something to talk about here. And he did help me a lot. And I in those years, I went to a couple of other therapists too. And once I started going to these meetings and thinking about my situation, and frankly thinking about my own behavior, it kind of blew up my first marriage because the marriage was founded on all sorts of on denial and all those bad things that we both inherited from our childhood. I mean, my first wife was a great person. Uh, you know, she just married the wrong guy, and I married the wrong woman. We were very bad for each other, and but I think at base we learned the worst of our habits because of the influence of alcoholism. That's what I would say. So, but then I met Mary, and those same, finding out about those things was the basis for my second marriage, which has been very happy. And as you may have even been able to observe from a distance.
I have.
Yeah.
On that happy note, can we just for a couple of minutes that we have remaining, switch back to you as a classicist? At the beginning, we heard about the Kingfisher Project, and I'm wondering if the young woman, Rebecca Pisall, who died because of her heroin habit, she was actually murdered.
Yeah.
Um, if if the Greeks were to reincarnate her or make something out of her circumstance, what would it be?
Well,
Would they turn her into a kingfisher?
yeah. I mean, you and I talked about this a little bit. I did a little research on kingfishers, and it turns out there's a fairly well known myth about the kingfisher. The kingfisher in Latin is called it's called Alcyone. That's the name of the young woman, and she and her husband are married and very happily married, and but they're a little bit too happy for the gods. They begin to behave in hubristically, arrogantly, and they compare themselves to Zeus and Hera, and that never works. And so they were both, yeah, right. So the husband is, I think Zeus has a storm come out on when he's at sea, and he drowns, and the wife is in horrible shape, and she is very distraught, and she prays to another god, and eventually she is led to the body of her husband that's just washed up on the shore, and she is completely miserable and destroyed, and so she throws herself into the ocean and drowns. So they both die, but the gods take pity on them and turn them into birds. And the bird that they turn them into is a kingfisher, and the name for a kingfisher in a sort of anglicized way is halcyon. So the phrase halcyon days has to do with the fact that in the myth, the gods arranged for Alcyone to have a 2 week period of completely tranquil weather, 1 week before the winter solstice, 1 week afterwards, when she can make a nest and lay her eggs. And so halcyon days refers to a period of serenity and tranquility that's arranged by the gods. That's the relationship to kingfisher. You're I thought about that, and for one thing, all stories about people being turned into birds, and there are lots of them in Ovid, are really, obviously escape fantasies. You get to the very end, and instead of dying or being destroyed, you're allowed to become a bird and fly off the earth and leave. So, in that sense, it's a kind of an escapist myth. Um, Sorry to say, it occurred to me that there's a connection to drugs and alcohol there. That they look like they're going to be an escape, but they're not. But the myth preserves the happy ending and so forth. So, and the tranquility. Well, maybe that's what happens when you use drugs and alcohol. I'm sure the Greeks didn't think about it that way, but I'm looking at it from where I am. That kind of what the dynamics of the stories seem to say to me. Uh, Now there are lots of other stories in Greek and Latin mythology that are, more reliable guides to how to live a good life, um, how to be a good person. But frankly, the Kingfisher story isn't one. And I don't mean to. that's in no way a comment on the excellent work that you do and everybody in the Kingfisher Project does. I understand from that story and I see why it happened. Uh, but that's what happened. That's the classical antecedent is halcyon days. Uh,
Well, perhaps we should think of this monthly show, in Rebecca's honor, as a halcyon day every time we go on the air.
Absolutely. I would say that you are a personal halcyon day for a lot of people, and the organization too. I mean, I'm very sincere about that. Anything that can be done to help people learn more and have a chance to get a little detachment from this thing that's afflicted them. I don't know. I really admire you, Bill. You know that I admire you and your wife Margot for all the work that you've done uh, over the years to raise awareness and so on. Nothing could be more important. And my own personal case, had anybody in my family been able to meet you and be in your programs, 50 years ago, maybe a lot of things would be different. But I don't see how you could spend your time in a more admirable way than what you're doing.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for your candor and your story, which I am sure will help people. Just so you know, my guest a month ago, we were talking about the prevalence of alcoholism in our listener area. And although the show is more about drugs, or certainly alcohol is the most prevalent drug in the area and the one that gets abused the most and has the most effects on people.
Yeah.
So hearing from you today is very, very important.
Well, I
Thank you so much, Tom.
well, thank you for asking me, Bill. I really appreciate it.
That's all the time we have for the Kingfisher Project. My guest has been Emeritus Professor of Classics at Oberlin College in Ohio, Thomas Van Nortwick. Thank you for sharing your story, Tom, and for your insight into Greek mythology and the Kingfisher Project. For more on the Kingfisher Project podcast, go to wjffradio.org. You can find past interviews with great guests, authors, advocates, policymakers, physicians, and those in recovery. And be sure to join us next month for a new edition of the Kingfisher Project, Information Against Addiction, right here on the local edition, only on Radio Catskill. Hang on, Tom.